Excellent. Welcome to another Sunday Superversive Livestream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and today is just me and Anthony, and we're going to talk about Roald Dahl's changes. Oh, I should mention, not that Roald Dahl is making any changes himself, but rather uh, that whoever has rights over his books is making changes. And it is a pretty messed up situation. Anthony, how are you doing today?
Wonderful.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'm sure Anthony is aware, but for those in the crowd, uh, essentially they're wokeifying Roald Dahl's books. It's the usual thing, removing language and stuff like that that is offensive. Offensive words like fat and ugly, which I'll remind everyone involved that it is only offensive when a woman is called that, and not most men. So it's almost entirely in a female light, from what I can see here. Baldness, women can wear wigs, and there's nothing wrong with that. Don't you dare call Aunt Sponge fat and James and the Giant Peach. Characters are not female, but rather women. Though I think in the term of Miss Trunchbull, the gag is that she's no woman at all and is only female by birth, and so on and so forth. They are, of course, introducing the idea that Oompa Loompas have a more than just men. Small men, small leprechauns from the jungle, bribed by
So
chocolate and a thousand other things. It's
here's
quite.
a true
Mm,
story with the Oompa Loompas that not a lot of people know nowadays. The Oompa Loompas, when they were first published, so this has been going on a very long time, were actually originally African pygmies. Like this was in the book. Like this was not something that was, Roald Dahl changed this in editing. This was in the published book. And then, to be fair, it was Dahl himself who changed this. Uh, he's the one who went back and he said, I don't know, I don't really like that.
yeah.
And it's one of those odd decisions where it's kind of like, to be honest, he was probably right to change it because the Oompa Loompas became kind of iconic on their own
Yes.
and in a way that they wouldn't have been if they were just, little African pygmy people. So, sort of interesting how that worked out. But yeah, this whole editing thing, Dal was adding himself. I saw briefly. Now, I pretty much don't use Twitter. I have a Twitter under a fake name that I use to keep track of certain people. But I don't post almost ever, and I never will because Twitter is a cesspool. I only very recently even got like the burner account for it. However, I did see you post there was somebody who was trying to make the claim that Roald Dahl was anti-Semitic. Uh, so there's a
Mic
couple
off.
of aspects to that. First off, going by the quote he gave, I'm not even sure that Dahl was actually anti-Semitic. Like the
Mic
quote was
on.
something along the lines of, uh, I forget the exact wording, but it was basically, I mean, the Nazis did it for a reason or something like that.
It.
Yeah,
Yeah. It was. Anyone. Oh, what is it? I have it on my timeline. Hold on.
but that's the gist of the quote, right? It was
Yeah.
like the Nazis did it for a reason, whatever the exact wording of it was. And I'm like, that's one of those things where I'm like, I don't even know if that is enough for me to be able to say that he is anti-Semitic. Like I've read Hilaire Belloc. He wrote that a wonderful, he's a historian and he
Mm,
wrote a wonderful book called The Jews. He's contemporaneous with Chesterton or thereabouts. Now, if the Jews, Hilaire Belloc is one of those people where it's like he's from the 20s. He wrote a book called The Jews. People just kind of then assumed he was an anti Semite and disqualified him. If you actually read the book, which I highly recommend because it's a great book, there's nothing remotely anti Semitic about the book. Uh, it's actually about he predicts the Holocaust about a decade before it happens. It's remarkable, really. Like, he actually has a line in the book. This came out in like the 1920s, where it's like, if we don't do something to resolve the issues with the Jewish people very soon, then some sort of absolutely massive disaster that will like rock our histories is going to happen, like, and very soon. And like a decade later, the Holocaust happens. So he predicts the Holocaust, right? So it's not an anti-Semitic book. He's like, he essentially specifies three different possibilities for what we might do with the Jews. One of them is extermination. And he expressly says in the book, this is obviously evil and we need to immediately discount it. And then he says the other thing is like deportation or like forced deportation. And he says this will essentially lead to evil things. So we also are forced to discount it. And his preferred solution was actually segregation. And this is kind of what we ended up going with by like giving them their own country and telling them you could go there. So uh, it sort of is what we did, though not exactly in the way he was talking about. He has some criticism for like Israel as well, but what I'm getting at here is that there is a portion in the book where he goes over the Bolsheviks and he goes, "Why are the Jews blamed for the Bolsheviks?" And again, Balak in the book, he is very much not an anti-Semite. He's trying to avoid violence to anti-Semites. You know, he's trying to give a fair shake to the Jewish people in the book. But he says, look, the reason that we blame the Jews for the Bolsheviks is that Bolshevism, you know, which is, for those who don't know, like Marxism, communism, whatever, right?
Yep.
Uh, that's the gist of it. Uh, it comes from the Jews.
Yep.
He's like, I'm not saying that all Jews are Bolsheviks. I don't think that. He's like, I'm not even saying the majority of them are Bolsheviks. I'm not saying that it's fair to say that it is responsible, you know, to lay the responsibility, right, like on all Jews. That's not fair. He goes, but it is a fact that Bolshevism comes from Jews, that it emerged from the Jewish people, that is what its root is, and that's why people are angry. And so I bring that up to say I would need more context in what Dahl was saying. Like, is Dahl trying to say, you know, I'm against killing them, but I can understand because man, those Jews sure stink, or you know, the Jewish people are responsible for quite a lot of bad things. So while what the Nazis are doing is reprehensible, you know, I could see like that a solution is needed. There isn't enough context here, and I'm not going to condemn a dead man, you know,
Right.
like how many years, 30 years after his death, or 30 plus years after his death, when he can't defend himself based off of like one vague line.
Yeah. And you know, it's one of those complicated issues, which I'm grateful that we're not monetized for because it would ruin our monetization. That, you know, it is a historical fact that most
The
of the
Bert and Ernie memes.
right. It is a historical fact that most of the Bolsheviks and the communists in Germany, pre Nazis, and all this other stuff were Jewish. They were of Jewish descent. They were taught by Jewish masters. Marx was a Jew. He was, in fact, kind of Jewish royalty. Um, you know, and so it's one of those things where you can look at it and you can sort of see what the reality is of it and go, you know, I don't like that. You know, we're not advocating anything, of course, but it's very clear that there is a historical precedent for these things. There are things I cannot talk about that, because it would just delete the channel, that were proven true because, you know, if you do the history and the research, and there's actually there's actually very good court records in European history, you know, back to the almost to the fall of Rome, that, you know, basically say, okay, this happened, this happened, this happened, and then they paid their way out of it. Um, you know, it's you know, anyone who is truthful with themselves and with history can have, you know, certain opinions about it. And the thing is that the deletion of these opinions doesn't change historical fact or precedent, especially when they're deleting things that Roald Dahl is saying, or they're changing up what he's saying so that he doesn't reference people like Joseph Conrad and so on and so forth. they're actively trying to, as I am right now, move the conversation away from truth. Not that I'm providing you lies. I mean that they're doing the truth thing. Uh, they're trying to destroy a lot of the information that is out there that people can look um, to make their own opinions. You must do these things. You must have these opinions to be righteous. And anyone who disagrees with them is unrighteous. But the thing is that as it's evolved, it's gone from things that are nasty. Nobody, except for some weirdos, is mad that Mein Kampf is generally banned from everywhere, or the Anarchist's Cookbook, or which has like bomb recipes on every page, uh, or any of these other things. Nobody's really mad about that. And then you have other ones where it's like some dude was like, okay, Looking for Alaska isn't a pornographic book. It has one scene where two underage characters have, blah blah blah, and it's very cold. And then they make out, and it's much more descriptive. It's like, nobody except for the people who are weirdly obsessed with that sort of thing complains about. And I was using his logic and reasoning. I believe that all sexual acts depicting minors should be banned, and the author investigated deeply for that kind of thing. Um, it nobody's complaining as much as people think when they're banned or removed. It's just some of the liberal moms sort of thing, some teachers. But then you're coming down to Roald Dahl. You're coming down to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, and all this other stuff. The push has finally gotten to the point where yes, they are editing out beloved children's books. It was always going to be this far. It was never going to be anything less than what we have now. And I don't even think people are waking up to it now. It's not even like good replacements, unless you have an opinion about what I just said, Anthony.
No, all sounds right to me. So the thing about Roald Dahl is Roald Dahl is a very nasty writer and a nasty person for that matter. Here's the thing, for all of this, like I've had this conversation with people before, and it's always so bizarre to me. Sometimes with people on the right, by the way, which I'll get to in a moment, but like they expect me to be much more horrified when I learn that, like, oh, X creator was actually a bad person. But, I'm not a leftist, and such things are like, yeah, seems like he was a bad person.
Yeah.
You know? And Roald Dahl is one of those people where it's like, so Roald Dahl has some of my favorite books ever. His autobiography, Going Solo, is fantastic. Now, it's probably like 50% made up, but it's a wildly entertaining book regardless. Uh, his Some of his children's books are some of my favorites. My personal favorite has always been Danny the Champion of the World, which is a lesser known book that was only ever made into a TV movie. But The Witches is a great book. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is a great book. One of the first posts I ever did for Castalia House was on the little known sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. But Roald Dahl was a cad who cheated on his wife pretty regularly. He had his good points as well, though.
Yeah.
Supposedly after his wife suffered from a stroke, they told him that she was never going to walk or be normal again. And Roald Dahl basically said "F all of you" and bullied his wife back to health, single handedly, which
Amazing.
is really funny to me. Uh, so so Dahl certainly had his good points, and he did fight in the RAF. He fought in the very little known Grecian campaign in World War II. The reason it's little known is that the Allies were soundly defeated there and relatively quickly, so nobody likes to talk about it. It's not a heroic story. They just got crushed out of Greece. But Dahl actually fought in the largest aerial battle of World War II that you have probably never heard of, called the Battle of Athens. He had an interesting life, Roald Dahl. Very, very interesting life. I wouldn't call him a good man though. And again, like people people seem to expect me to like be disappointed when it's like, oh, your heroes have been destroyed. Like, no, I don't
No.
really have that sort of attitude with people. Like, I remember with Miyazaki, there's this weird subset of the right that I've dealt with, and I mentioned this, I think, last week or a couple weeks ago as well. Like, that hates Miyazaki. And I sort of see it, like, on one level. Miyazaki was a Marxist up until the 90s or so,
Mm-hmm.
where he went away from that. And you could see it in films like Castle in the Sky a little bit, Nausicaa a little bit. Actually, I think Princess Mononoke came out in the 90s, and I think that's actually where you start to see a little bit of cynicism with the philosophy start to creep into that movie. But, uh, it's not so black and white, right? But like I get it. I get why the right is somewhat suspicious of a guy like Miyazaki, right? He's called himself a feminist before, although I will note that he really only calls himself to that when people like ask him point blank, "Are you a feminist?" And then he's just like, yeah, sure. Yeah. If you say so." Oh, but I think he's actually much less obnoxious than Takahata, who I don't like. But like, I get what I'm saying is I get the skepticism towards him. However, as someone who has watched all of his movies and who has a functioning brain and who is willing to make my own judgments, I don't think that Miyazaki is a subversive, right? I think
Right.
he's an actual genius. And I think that he mostly, at least, like probably 95% deserves his reputation. You know, uh, I don't think like, and I think that people who are missing that, I think they're missing out. So I once had a conversation with this has been years now, so I don't even remember the group it was with, but it was with some sort of like vaguely right wing group where they called Princess Mononoke like leftist propaganda or something like that. And I basically said like this was back when I was on Twitter and it was a mistake. Because I said something on the lines of that is complete nonsense. Like you don't know, like you just have no idea what you're talking about. And then they asked me like why, and I said I'm not gonna like spend 20 minutes explaining it to someone who's clearly already made up their mind. I've written 20 articles, go and read them. And then they started going on and saying that I must have won a blue check mark, like because I was like shilling my articles or something on Twitter. And I was literally like, "What are you talking about? Just leave me alone. I'm done." like, and then they started like going, that Miyazaki, like he messed with his son or what? I said, "Yeah, that was pretty bad." And then they're just like, "So doesn't that bother you?" And I'm like, "Why?"
Maybe his son should
Yeah,
have made a good movie.
yeah. Well, like jokes aside, it's like it seems, it
Yeah.
looks like it was a family issue. Seemed like he treated his son like a jerk. Uh, Bummer.
Yeah. Like it's
Like
I
I
complete
don't
and I
understand why you expect me to be concerned about this.
and I,
People can like it always baffles me. People will be like, "Ha, but did you know that this author actually believes this horrible thing?" And I go, "Huh, that's a shame."
right.
Yeah. There's a difference between something like that, some sort of family issue. It turns out Miyazaki might not be a very nice guy. Oh well. And or Roald Dahl cheated on his wife. Like that's terrible. Sucks for her,
Yep.
Uh and then there's like J.K. Rowling says that, J.K. Rowling insults her own fans and gaslights them about like what's going on in the books and just makes shit up. Or she redefines her book so that there's sexual pervert so that some of her main characters, as it turns out, have secretly been sexual perverts the whole time, and she tells this to children. You know, like that's an entirely different thing. Like my problem with J.K. Rowling is not that J.K. Rowling is a bad person. Like I could deal with her being a bad person. That really doesn't matter much to me. You know,
Yep.
my problem with J.K. Rowling is the way that J.K. Rowling interacts with her fan base. That she seems to she seems to have taken her success for granted, and she's like intentionally harming children. Like she is hurting children with her words. Like the fact that she lies, like there was this whole thing in the new terrible Fantastic Beasts movies. And like one of them was that Voldemort's giant
Right.
snake was actually like a Korean woman who was trapped as a snake. And somebody like messaged her and said, "How long did you have this idea?" And she said something like, "Tried 30 years," like as if it was always her idea. And I'm like, screw you, that's a lie. You did not think there is no indication in the books that Nagini was ever a giant snake. Like you just made that up. Why? Why did you feel the need to do this? Why are you lying? It's weird to me. Like that's the stuff that bothers me. So
Right.
Roald Dahl might be a bad person, does not bother me. Like, okay, I guess I won't be taking advice on how to please my wife from Roald Dahl.
And it's
Yeah.
like a lot of, creative types are just terrible people. Like creativity doesn't come from nowhere. Like Tolkien and Lewis and stuff like that are exceptions, but even then, there are like if you look at Lewis's personal life,
I was gonna say Tolkien's an exception, Lewis not so much.
right? Yeah, and I'm about to bring that up, but it's like he has some things that are definitely non-Christian. He went after a divorced woman, and I'm not saying that he didn't he did marry her, right? Yeah, he
I
did.
believe he married Joy Davidman, yes.
Yeah, so it's like there's some flaws there. Ultimately, he got back to the Christian ideal, but like if you're asking for perfection from anybody, you're not going to get it. I've got some skeletons in my closet. I'm sure Anthony. Oh no, Anthony's perfect. He's never had a bad day in his life. But I've got some deep dark skeletons in my closet, and I've talked about them sometimes here. I have tendencies. All creatives I've seen had some very strong tendencies to different kinds of self-destruction. Some are slothful, some are wrathful. A lot of them are wrathful. Some will some in history have been absolutely insane gamblers, who would win and lose fortunes in a single night, multiple fortunes, and then just kind of go home and slump on their garret. Um, we had a whole thing this week where like authors went, "Oh, you have to be, for the art, or you have to be for the business only," and it's like, can't the art be a business? No, you're just going to be a jerk to people who just want to write books with a high artistic standard. Screw you guys. Or the vice versa. Oh, what? You're not going to treat it like a business? Then you shouldn't publish. You're muddying the waters. Blah blah blah. Like that doesn't come from normal, behavioral mindsets. And it's the same way with like a lot of like CEOs I've worked for, like uh like several of them always have these weird quirks, these behavioral issues. It's also the same thing that makes them driven to make a business. Like if you're asking for elites to be normal, quote unquote elites, you're not going to get it. Why can't you be normal? And the kid just starts screaming again. Like that's the whole experience. And a lot of it is not like a deliberate choice. I didn't wake up one day and decide I'm going to have unpopular opinions about things. I looked at what the truth of the matter was and said, yeah, truth matters. We're going to do that. Damn all the consequences. There's, there, I've, like I look at other people who are geniuses and I see their quirks. And we could go over it. Various friends, we've had deep relationships with, you see the flaws. And then when you see the flaws, you either have to accept the flaws as a natural part of their character, or of their sin nature, as the case may be, or you splash yourself against it. And I'm gonna be, real with you. They're never going to change. And you have to kind of vibe with it, or you know, get angry and rage against the thing that's never going to change. It's your choice. But, yeah, authors having weird or terrible ideas isn't anything new in the world. Van Gogh's depression. I was reading about the life of some painter, who was a big gambler and like would fight people and stuff. Victor Hugo of The Hunchback of Notre Dame and all the other things that he wrote, um, visited every brothel in Paris multiple times. He was incredibly well known. Uh, it was, what do you want? I got nothing for you.
So yeah, first off, I'm going to point out here, and I think it is important to say that uh, the issue is that everybody has these flaws, right?
Yep,
Like it's so to be clear, I wouldn't limit it to just creatives. With that said, I get it. Like when you get into like the truly great creators, you see something in like deep emotion and whatever. But
yeah.
like one thing that I think I want to make clear, and I've seen
Sorry,
this. Oh, go ahead.
before we continue, I do mean like in excess. Like I know gamblers, I know this type of people and that type of people, but very few push it in the same way. Like there's self-destruction, and then there's self-destruction where win 1 million francs, but then get killed in a duel in the morning, sort of thing. Like there's that sort of weird. I don't know.
Sure. On the other hand, though, you sometimes get that with mathematicians. You've heard that story, I'm guessing.
No, I
Yes,
haven't.
no.
No.
The mathematician who who had a duel over a woman, and he had an inclination that he or like some sort of premonition or thought that he was going to die the next day, so he wrote up the vast majority of his life's work the day before the day before the duel, and that ended up being like revolutionary on the field. I don't know the name or the details off the top of my head, but I
Probably
imagine this
Leibniz.
can't be that. What was that?
It's probably Leibniz or something.
I can't imagine it would be that hard to find.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, the point is like genius. It happens with. However, one thing I do want to make clear, and this is one of these things that is a bit of a modern backlash that I think is correct. I would make sure to be careful to attribute the fact that the genius does not come from the flaws,
Yep.
right? The source of the genius is not the flaws.
Yep.
Like, this is very important because it's very often misunderstood. You hear people going, like, well, he was such a tortured soul, but that's what made him great. No, no,
Nope.
that's wrong. That is not what made them great. That stopped them from being even more great than they could have been. Somebody mentioned, like, why was Van Gogh such a great artist? How did he make, such beautiful artwork out of pain? And the answer to this is not because he channeled his pain to artwork. It's because he had a brother that he was close to, who loved him, who tethered him to reality.
Yep.
Like, there was
And
not the pain. It was his brother's love that made him have such beautiful artwork.
yep. And it's if you actually like do an honest reading of Van Gogh's life without the weird emotion, he was actually on the up and up, towards the end of his life. Like he was, less depressed. In fact, there's a pretty big theory that he didn't actually shoot himself. He was
Yep,
accidentally shot, and then he, basically covered for the guy. Um, I don't think he should have, but that's just me. Like it's the if it wasn't for sloth, a slothful author would write more. If it wasn't for wrath, somebody wouldn't get shot in a duel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
exactly. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I'm always very uncomfortable with this. Like the so here's where there's a grain of truth here. Like a lot of these geniuses, the excess makes its way into their flaws as well, but it's also an excess of genius. The thing is, they would be even greater if they conquered their flaws. They are
Yep,
not greater, right? That's not like they are not great because of those flaws. They are great in spite of them. This is a very particular important point.
yep,
Like Heath Ledger did not put together a better performance as the Joker because he was depressed.
yep,
That's not what happened. That's a lie.
yep,
And if you think that's what happened, you've been fooled. right, by the legend. First off, his performance as a Joker probably had almost nothing to do with his suicide, right? Like
Yeah.
the connection doesn't, the timeline doesn't actually match up. People thought it did because of, he died before the movie came out. But when you actually look at the timeline of him working on the movie and the downward spiral, they were separate.
Yep.
But for another thing, the way that we should be looking at this is the fact that he did not get the help he needed and that his depression robbed us of years and years or decades of performances like by Heath Ledger. Like that's what just happened there. That's
Yep.
not it was in no way, shape, or form a good thing. It was not a sacrifice for the art.
Yep.
So going back then, where am I connecting this with Roald Dahl? Well, we were talking about like the flaws and things and the rewriting of Dahl's works.
Yeah.
So even if we accept that Dahl is a flawed human being, which I'm happy to do, even the best interpretations show that he was probably a serial cheater, right? Like,
Yep.
which I don't approve of morally. Yeah. Yeah.
Big
Uh,
shock. Anthony, a Catholic,
big
is a
stuff.
Christian. Who knew?
Yes. So even with that interpretation, there's something really dishonest about the fact that he released these books, he died, right? And then 30 years later, they started editing them without his consent.
Yep.
Now, Eldritch Fan is mentioning Neil Gaiman, Stephen King, and the like are just fine with their work getting rewritten. First, they are, uh, I'm trying to think of the word. Well, they're social justice warriors for one thing, but even besides that,
They're sellouts,
they're
Anthony.
alive.
They're
What was that?
sellouts. Sellouts.
Yeah, they're alive, is what they are. Uh, it's not a comparison.
It's
Whether or
unfair that
not they care,
they get bestsellers while they're still alive. It's not fair, Anthony.
it's not. But the point I'm making here is the very fact that they are still alive means that this is not an analogous situation. And
Yeah.
I don't see why I should really care about what their opinion is more than any other human being on Roald Dahl's work getting rewritten. It's like, that's great that you two don't care, but you're not Roald Dahl. He wasn't asked.
Yep.
He's dead.
And he'd probably be against it. Memes aside, an author, at a certain point, the choices become too deliberate to change. The genius isn't
Yes.
in the unpleasantness of characters; it's how the characters are unpleasant, and other things besides. And also, I want to be clear: if the fact that Neil Gaiman has maintained even as squeaky clean a reputation as he's had is an absolute shock to me. And Stephen King ends it with a child sex scene, um, or
Yeah,
you
I
know,
flipped open it once and like I hit on that scene. It was it was disgusting. Like,
yes,
and it made me wonder like how this book was allowed to be published, to be honest with you.
yep,
Uh Especially like no adaptation keeps it.
right.
It adds absolutely nothing to the story. It's just bizarre.
But yeah, like the character of the things, like whatever was wrong with Roald Dahl, it didn't translate to social justice warrior dumb, and it certainly didn't translate to a hatred of his own culture and a determination to lie about reality.
Right, exactly. He doesn't do the rolling thing at any point where he starts going off on his fans for, not believing the right things. Now, Rowling is at the very least on the side of reality when it comes to transgenderism. People make way too big of a deal of this.
Mm,
Like I've seen people say this like with Matt Walsh as well. Oh, but he's an advocate against transgenderism. And it's like, so what? Anybody
right,
with like literally half a brain can see how insane it is.
right,
Like J.K. Rowling is mega rich and is suffering absolutely no consequences for her quote unquote bravery,
yep,
right? Like none whatsoever. So I can't say that the fact that, okay, I guess she hasn't so completely lost the plot that she's willing to call men women and women men makes me think that I guess she's secretly an ally. And this actually bothers me to the point where sometimes I see like right wing friends or whatever, and sometimes half joking, but going, well, now I guess I gotta buy this new Rowling thing to support her. And it's like, do you not
No.
understand that J.K. Rowling hates you?
Yep.
Like she absolutely despises you, and you're giving her money because why? She doesn't think that, she thinks that if you have a penis, you're a guy. Like that's con- newsflash. Everybody thinks that.
Right.
Like
And
there is
it's
nobody who does not think that.
like if people are like, well, it's a right wing dog whistle. Well, no, like Christianity is, as believing in Jesus Christ and preaching it does not make a right winger. Like it's like you can be a Christian and be against the culture you were born in. There's no actual like contradiction between Christianity and being anti-American. As weird as it is to say, Paul is very explicit when he calls up to Titus to go to Crete and goes, "Hey, make sure that the Cretans, aren't lazy gluttons anymore. Their culture of being thieves and vagabonds and stuff like that is not acceptable," is what he's saying in very Roman terms. Because he was a Jew and a Roman. It's like they're barbarians. Make them Christian. Not that I'm saying Titus, it's just work of Jesus Christ, but like there's the characteristics of the Cretan people at that time was not acceptable, and Christianity fixed them. Sure, they might have kept the national dress and so on and so forth, just like the Anglo Saxons kept the national dress, just like Romans still wore togas and all this other stuff. But certain parts of the culture fundamentally changed with the addition of Christianity. And somebody going, well, like with what's that crazy guy's name? Holes and Shia LaBeouf. Him doing the Padre Pio thing didn't make him a Christian, and he's fallen back away from that now. Like it was
See,
never.
I haven't seen like I mean, don't get me wrong, it's like anything is plausible at that point. I just haven't seen anything about it.
Yeah, so like I'm not sure how recent this is, so it's like I'm not even sure on the context. But if I take the context at face value, um, he's already doing other things and being crazy again, and all this other stuff. Um,
My understanding with Shia LaBeouf is that it came out that for a new Francis Ford Coppola movie, he was in drag. So this is my take on it, and keep in mind that my world does not fall or does not rise or fall on Shia LaBeouf in any sense. Like I saw the one interview, and that is the extent of how I followed him since then, and seeing this picture come up, right?
right.
So I hope he does not fall away. Like I hope that nobody else falls away. I don't think he has yet. However, I do think that Shia LaBeouf is somebody who hasn't fully imbibed yet what it means to be Christian.
Yep.
The people who do like what Royce, was it Royce? I always
Yes.
confuse the R name pickup artists.
Or Roosh, you mean?
Yeah, Roosh, Royce, Rollo, all like meld in my head. Roosh, yeah, I think you're right. So when Roosh converted to Christianity and sold all of and took all of his books off the marketplace and publicly repented, said all of his pickup artist stuff was bad. I That's literally like I think the only time I've ever seen that happen. Does that mean that I've never seen another conversion? No, I have. It's just that most of the time when other people convert, their entire life doesn't completely change overnight.
Right.
Like so I am hopeful that Shia LaBeouf is eventually gonna look back and go like, hey, maybe I shouldn't be doing films like this.
Right. And if
Right?
he
Like,
if he signed a contract, who knows how long ago, there is a certain amount of honor to finishing a contract, even if it's humiliating. But it's yeah, like it's still a bad look for somebody who said, who claimed whatever he claimed. Who even knows anymore? Um, is I want to move us on, but it's like a right wing dog whistle like saying, trans women aren't women or whatever is not actually a right wing dog whistle. Um, true like the true ally isn't in one thing that they agree on. Like, I'm of the opinion that Matt Walsh is just a grifter. I'm of a very strong opinion that most of these guys are grifters. They're just more on my side than, Greta Thunberg or whatever. You know, Richard Spencer is obviously a grifter, and Andrew Anglin and others. You look at that stuff and you see, hey, but I want an ally, but the thing is that they're not there. They're not there in the same way that, like, we're here, that other people like John C. Ryder here. You can't depend on somebody who seeks after media fame in the manner that they do to defend ideas that they themselves will not believe. You know, Having the opinion that children should not be sexually assaulted is nowhere on the spectrum of politics, or even on most standards that you can have. It's on the standard of being a basic, decent human being. That
Honestly,
children
it's
shouldn't
more
be
on it's I wouldn't even go that far with it. It's like on the standard of not being a psychopath.
right. Like, yeah, and honestly, I mean that more than an actual human being sort of thing. But it's, you know, you can't. Yeah,
I
it's
get your point.
yeah,
Eldritch fan asks two good questions. The first one I think is particularly on topic, and I'll tackle it. If the right ever gets political and cultural power, should they start rewriting left wing stuff? I take such questions seriously. So to be clear, like I am not against the concept of censorship in theory. I think that the modern hysteria against censorship is incorrect. Uh, Censorship is appropriate in certain circumstances.
yep,
However, censorship is, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's appropriate all the time and in all circumstances, but in certain places and certain circumstances is absolutely okay. Uh,
yep,
but with that said, that's different than rewriting things. And I would say no. I cannot think of a situation where I would say it is okay to take a left wing work and rewrite it.
yep,
That is, and I'll tell the reason I would say this is fundamentally what that is a lie.
yep,
Lying is wrong. Now, this is, like really straightforward, basic moral fact stuff, right? Now, I understand that there is a bit of a debate open for interpretation idea of like, well, what if they're not owed the lie? This doesn't even fall in like a gray area, right? Like this is just straight up you are telling people something that isn't true. You are making them believe that this person believed something that they should not, that they did not actually believe.
yep,
So no, I am not in favor of rewriting left-wing works. I am in favor of in a particular type of society and a particular type of work on a case by case basis, considering censorship of such works.
yep,
And that would mean not, removing it, not making it public, making it not available for children or something like that. Uh, but not rewriting.
right,
And the second question he asks is, could Roosh rewrite his pickup artist books to focus on attracting a good woman and ending in matrimony? Well, there's two aspects to this. First is, can he just rewrite his old books? I think the answer is no. And this is, to be clear, I never read them, but my understanding of them is that, like, they were, that isn't even close to what they were about.
right,
Right, like they were about, scoring as many women as possible and using it to, and by scoring I mean sleeping with, and there was not even the idea of it ending in marriage or any sort of healthy relationship was not on the radar.
yeah.
Now, could he
There's,
write? Go
sorry.
ahead.
So there, like, I think with Eldritch Fan, you might be mistaking the purpose of the book for the book itself. Like, the purpose of the it child sex scene is to show that they're moving from adulthood and, moving away from childish cares and blah, 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 blah. You could write a dissertation about what they mean.
Oh,
What
I
did
know
you mean?
exactly the literary theory behind it, but you don't need
Absolutely.
to show the scene to get that point.
Exactly. It could be
Like,
any, like, there's different ways to do it, but the purpose of it is its own thing. The same way with Rush's books. The purposes of it is not matrimony, period. He says, and I agree with him, that many of the techniques he taught, or he teaches, since we're talking about the past in a present tense, can also be used for marriage. But the purpose is to have sex with as many women as possible in whatever nation you're in. Like he even wrote nation by nation as he went through them, having sex with many, many women. And I absolutely believe his stories just because I see how he acts in his personality. Like I see other men who are also kind of PUA kind of guys do it. And I don't mean like mystery or whatever stupid crap Honeybach thing is. Like the purpose of Judge Dredd, if you remove the violence, it wouldn't be Judge Dredd. But the purpose of it is, the totalitarian state and the ridiculous characters who live in it, providing sort of a dark comedy. The purpose of the rise and fall. I'm just looking around my room, by the way. The purpose of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire is not to lambast Christianity, but many of its points come back to an attack on Christianity within the Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. You know, the what's another one? Um, if you removed, let's see, there's a book like Parabolus where if you removed the weird gay romance that shows up at the end, nothing would change. Like you could censor that, quote unquote, and it wouldn't change the book. But the same way with House of Leaves. If you removed the really stupid main character who's reading the Niven manuscript, you remove that. Yeah, sure, it's just the Niven manuscript, but most people wouldn't be as interested because they find the stupid dude who's just reading this like an idiot, reading the Rosetta Stone, to be very funny and to increase the enjoyment of it. Like, there's purposes to everything that's in a book if the author is an appropriate writer, if they have skill. Um, and if you remove that, you still do not take away the purpose of the book. Um, if you took things like Mein Kampf and took away all the references to the Jews, why in the world is Hitler angry? All of a sudden becomes the big question. If you took it away, it's still a propaganda manual. It's still this, it's still that. Or the horror from Junji Ito's work, it becomes nothing. So on and so forth.
yeah, I get the point. What I was going to say is like, could he write one on finding a good woman? My understanding is he's not married now. Now that doesn't mean that he wouldn't have anything to say on the topic,
Right.
but there are priests who have my understanding is they've written extremely well received books on these topics.
Yeah. And by the way, I could believe that he could write a good book on attracting a mate. But the thing is that if you look at his grand total work, it is not about that. It is about sex. If he got married and said, "This is the experience I had as a pickup artist who repented and married and became, a full man rather than just a playboy man," I think it would be very worthwhile just because he
Yep,
knows how to talk about it.
yep, I would agree. Uh, Generally, so I'm on Twitter and going through some of like finding threads on the stuff that's been changed. So in the Roald Dahl book, so here is the majority of it. Uh, First, the majority of stuff that changes any reference to fat. is removed. Roald Dahl enjoyed making characters, making fun of fat people, like as an insult. But
Amazing.
when he's talking about so when he's talking about fat and like making fun of them for it, he's not talking about somebody who's like a little chubby. He's talking about people who are like enormously grotesquely overweight, and then he calls them fat.
Right.
Any references that are like specific to a specific people have been removed. And what I mean is this. Here's an example from his book Trot, uh, which is a fun, cute little children's book, is how I would put it, honestly. And says this is the original quote. That's where all these tortoises in England come from. And a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret. And then it's changed to that's where some of these tortoises in England come from. And a local person told me the secret.
Wait, why did
So
they
any
censor
reference,
Bedouin? Like, that is a
yeah.
legitimate people group. Like, they are an actual tribe of people who. What?
So I think they did because they don't want to. They thought it might be negatively received that the tortoises of the story. It's been a while since I read this one, so I can't remember exactly why. But the tortoise they didn't want to indicate that like people from North Africa were responsible for running this like scam. Now, if that's dumb to you, we already know that. So I'm just
Yes.
telling, right?
So,
I'm just
yeah.
telling you. I
It's.
think that's the idea.
Yeah, I get you.
Uh,
But it's.
Tortoises, go ahead.
But it's like, to me, the big sticking point is the. No, you know what? I've already said everything about this stuff that I could possibly say. Uh,
It's very dumb,
it's very dumb.
right? Like
Yes.
it's just incredibly dumb. And any references to mothers or fathers having say separate jobs has been removed. Uh the word hag has been removed, I guess
I
because it's seen as too much of like a gender specific slur.
mean, yes.
Like so
I haven't
they
used that
removed
word
that.
myself. I need to use it more.
Bizarrely, ladies and gentlemen was removed in place of folks because I guess it's gendered. You might be leaving out like transgender people or something. Uh, Also, I'm just gonna read this quote from the Twits, which is a very funny book. I'm just gonna read this quote that they censored because this original quote is really funny. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. I just find that very amusing. They just took out the reference to dirty old hags have itchy tummies.
Right.
Uh, Augustus Gloop, they remove like all references to him being fat. His aunts being fat. Here's a really good. Here's a really strong example of like this sort of female specific stuff. Even if she is this is from the witches, and I don't know the context surrounding it, but I remember that like the witches disguise themselves as human women is like the idea, and they're like a separate species almost. By the way, The Witches is actually kind of a terrifying book. Highly recommended. But even if she is working as a cashier in a supermarket or typing letters for a businessman. So he's, if I'm understanding the context of this right, he's just saying something along the lines of, she could be anyone, even if they're working as a cashier or they're a typist, right? Like
Right.
any normal woman. And they changed it to, and this is actually really funny to me because of just how like obvious it is. Even if she is working as a top scientist or running a business, like they couldn't even choose a normal job, right? Like they had to
Right.
overcorrect that far.
Right.
Uh, there's a line where like the witches wear wigs to disguise the fact that they're bald. Uh, and he says, "Don't be foolish," my grandmother said. "You can't go around pulling the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. Just you try it and see what happens." So witches need to wear gloves to hide their claws. Now, that sounds like it would be kind of an obvious sign to us, but
Right.
Remember, that used to be like a fashionable thing. Women would wear like long gloves. So the grandmother saying you can't go around pulling the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. In other words, like gloves are not uncommon enough that that's a sign on its own. And
Right.
they change it to, don't be foolish, my grandmother says. Besides, there are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs, and there is certainly nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong at
Like,
all.
uh, she went, and from Matilda, she went. This is, I think, the context of this is that Matilda is describing all of the people that she reads and how they like allow her to escape her life. Matilda's a little girl in the book, right? And she lives with her terrible parents.
Right.
Uh, and it says she went on olden day sailing ships with Joseph Conrad. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and to India with Rudyard Kipling. And it was changed to she went to 19th century estates with Jane Austen. So Joseph Conrad, I don't know what the controversy is surrounding him, but
Oh
apparently he's
yes,
out.
I
I
know.
don't like. I legitimately just don't know. I don't know anything about him.
I'll talk
Uh,
about it in
she
a minute.
she went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway. Was kept for some reason, which seems weird to me, but okay. And California with John Steinbeck. So obviously Kipling had to be right out.
Right.
Yeah. Um.
Can't support the Raj in this
Yeah.
town.
So I think there's something worth asking here. Uh. The question is, what's the big deal,
Yes.
right? Like, so what? Does this fundamentally change the experience of reading Roald Dahl?
Yes.
I I think the answer is no and yes.
Ooh.
No, in the sense that you will enjoy the books even with the changes. The genius signs shines through, right? Like
Right.
he was a legitimately brilliant children's book author. Uh Interestingly, Roald Dahl actually wrote about this in I read this essay in the library by Roald Dahl. It was a collection of ghost stories. And remember, Roald Dahl had a reputation as a horror writer in Europe. So he wrote the foreword to the collection of ghost stories. And it's actually a really interesting foreword because he says that uh, women were very underrepresented in the publishing world, but he says, except in children's books. He says women were much better children's book writers and ghost story writers. And then he goes on a really fascinating tangent where he says people think that like it must mean that children's book writers are easier, like children's books are easier to write. And I'm like, he goes, that is wrong. Uh, and I know this is wrong because once an anthology was put together where they invited all of the top writers in England to write a children's story, and it was so bad that that they did not even publish it. So he goes, the fact that women like dominate children's book writing, he's like, make no mistake, that is a legitimate skill. And he's like, and I don't know why women dominate in this field. I'm not going to try bothering, but it is a legitimate skill. So I say this to say that Roald Dahl, I don't think was a genius writer for adults all the time. He had certain excellent stories, but he also had his fair share of like, you could just kind of skip this, right?
Right.
But he was a legitimately brilliant children's book writer. Uh, he had a particular genius with children's literature. And I think he deserves some credit for that. So I think the problem fundamentally here is less any of the specific changes that we're seeing and more the precedent that's being set here of somebody who is not the author without the consent of the author, right? Decades after his death can
Yep.
decide on behalf of everybody else and on behalf of the author himself what is and is not acceptable for the public to read.
Yep.
Like, This is not their book. They do not have the right to make changes to this book. It has already been published. The version that was published did not, this is not what was written in it.
Yep.
So it is not up to these people, whoever they are, these editors, these sensitivity readers, to tell me what I would want to read in my Roald Dahl book. Frankly, the fact that these changes, whether or not they're important, misses the point, because that's not for them to decide. Well, it's not important enough to change it. Like, they're not the ones to decide that.
Yep.
I decide that as the reader. I decide if I would rather read this book or not. And more importantly, Dahl, the actual creator, is the person who decides it. He decided it was important enough to include in his book. That was his decision.
Yep.
He did not decide. He decided to use the word fat. He thought it was important enough to his story to include it. There was never any note on there, well, this is a small enough deal that you can remove it. No, that was never mentioned. That was never talked about.
Yep. And quite
Like,
frankly, there's certain things and implications with fat that, make it a very useful tool that are incredibly important. The character of a fat person is different from the character of a thin person every time, all the time. And quite frankly, fat people hate to be reminded of it, because it means that they have to do a little work, a little effort. And speaking as a fat man, it's a lot of effort to lose even a pound. And there's a lot of psychological effort with it too. And they don't want to see it. They don't want to touch it. They don't want to feel it. They don't want to hear it. So that's why, in this case, fat is a common target for these people. And you can do it with other things as well. Why is the baldness a thing? It implies a certain ugliness to women that people don't really want to face because of simpery, and many other things. Like removing the character traits and just saying, oh, he's beastly. Well, I'm sure the furries would like to have a word about that. you know, Gotta watch out for
I'm
that.
looking at the comments and I'm getting, can only imagine what they'll do to C.S. Lewis. And yeah, Lewis is an interesting one. I think they're going to be more careful and wait longer before they change Lewis, because Roald Dahl had a very general audience. Like, he didn't have an audience of, Christians and right wingers. Lewis does. Now, it's,
Right.
don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Lewis doesn't have broad appeal, but I mean, when you start changing Lewis, you're talking about an audience that will immediately notice
Yep.
and will immediately comment. So I don't think we're gonna see anything with Lewis for a while. But don't get me wrong, it's not because they wouldn't want to do it to Lewis. They absolutely would love to. It's
Yep.
because I think they know they can't get away with it yet.
Yep. And they're gonna try with the new Netflix thing, by the way. By
Oh
the
yeah.
by.
Oh yeah. 100% they will. Oh hey, MJ Marzo. I know her. Says I think they'd ban him before they rewrite him. I agree.
Yep.
I definitely agree. They'll try. I don't think we've reached that point in the culture yet, which is not to say we won't. I think we probably will. But we're not there yet.
Not there
Stock up
yet.
on your paperbacks, people.
I mean, yeah. I don't like Roald Dahl personally. Like it's, his censorship isn't like something I'm gonna go stomping for. But at the same time, it's like if I see an old copy, I'm probably gonna pick it up. Uh, and others as well. Like I've been building a pretty substantial paperback and hardcover collection. Um, where it's just things I'm kind of worried about being censored. And I know that a lot of people have copies, and Project Gutenberg exists and other things as well.
Yep.
But just remember, not any. nothing is set in stone. There, even though I live in St. Louis, it is within capability that I might be the only owner of the completed short stories of Maupassant, who has some very interesting works like Bellamy in a 100-mile radius of me. Like, if the internet shuts down. Like, you might think that's a little overbearing, but, there is always a chance that you might have the last copy within a certain area. Therefore, keeping those copies are are important in the current cultural battle, especially if they take down Project Gutenberg.
Yeah. And see, so first off, I can understand why you don't like Dal. I'll start off by saying that Dahl is very much a like there are going to be people who just don't vibe with what he's doing at all. He has a very particular appeal, right? He does
Right.
not do nuanced characters at all. He's very intentional about it. There's a great interview in my copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. There is a great interview where he talks about that his style of creating characters is good characters he makes very 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 good, and bad characters he makes very 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 bad, and he exaggerates everything. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's a very particular style. So, I can understand why it would not appeal to everybody. So it's not so shocking to me that it's like, oh, you're not a huge fan of Roald Dahl. Like, yeah, I get it. With that said, it's to be honest, even if you weren't like this could be anyone they could be talking about. This could literally be any author, right? Like, and we would still be having this live stream today.
Yep.
The fact that it's an author that I personally am a big fan of adds a little bit of I don't know I don't know what the phrase would be here. It adds a little bit of skin in the game, right? That
Yeah.
like no, this is a guy that I actually regularly read and enjoy,
Yeah.
right? And they're changing his works.
it
Uh,
it helps boost the opinions of these things, because a lot of people don't think about literature the way that we or our audience does. It's just something that they commodify. Romance novels sell, and there's one romance novel story, maybe at as many as five, if you're willing to stretch the definition. It's you can't expect people to get it.
Right, but I'll tell you what, if I learned that they were doing, I don't know, I'm gonna mention like the only modern romance novelist that I know of, like Danielle Steele, right?
Mm,
If they had done this to Danielle Steele's works, we would still be having this conversation.
sure.
It
I
would not hit home as closely because I
Yeah.
am not a fan of hers.
Right.
That's the difference here.
I get you. Hmm.
Anything you want to add? I know I've said everything that I want to say. So like basically we are officially opposed to it, and we're officially opposed to it because of the precedent.
Yep.
It is a lie. It's not going to be hard to find Dahl's original works. And certainly I would not be surprised if there were teams that were already putting stuff together to make sure that they had those original works.
Yep.
But I don't like if it's not up to them to decide what is and isn't an important change, what should and shouldn't be changed. In one of his books, in probably the most bizarre change that I've seen, they actually add a dedication to George's Marvelous Medicine. They dedicate it to doctors, which is just the strangest thing. Like,
Right.
why would you think you could do that?
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
so weird. Uh, you know, like, what if Roald Dahl hated doctors? In fact, we have some evidence to believe that he didn't really like them very much.
See his wife incident.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I could easily imagine going, why are we dedicating this to doctors? Like, screw doctor.
right?
Uh,
They're
it's
actively
just bizarre.
erasing medical records in Canada for those who are, shall we say, no longer pure-blooded. Like they're just as likely to wear a jackboot as any other, police officer or soldier. But uh, I guess if I wanted to say stuff about this, like Bradford Walker mentions that he puts down terms for how his papers are to be handled. Especially that sequel to the Star Night Rescue run. I'm just saying, Bradford. I haven't forgotten. I love you. I love you dearly, but I need that sequel. But like it's like Vox Day. Oh, he had a great thing to say about that. Um, you know, it's pure and unadulterated evil. It is erasure of the author from his own works. Unfortunately, it is something that we have come across in some of our communications with the literary heirs of authors. For those who don't know, he does this Castalia Library thing where he publishes old books with very excellent editions. The prize of my library is a John C. Wright Awaken the Nightland library copy. For all Vox Day's spines, he is a true believer in the same cause as we do. Therefore, I am always proud to stand on the same side as him. Just like I know he has said similar things in the past, even though probably his definition is a little more narrow than mine, but take the good with the bad. Uh, you know, I muddied the waters. Uh, but basically, sometimes he contacts to make these books, basically go, no, you're too right wing. That sort of thing. Whose views are not entirely harmonious with those heirs. For every Christopher Tolkien who defends his father's legacy like a lion, there are 3 or 4 children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren who are happy to sacrifice it on the twin altars of Moloch, Mammon, and political correctness. Um, you can't say it better. It's always money for those people who don't get it. For me, it's never just the money. Um, Partially because I know what'll happen. This will happen. Christopher Tolkien was a great man, an understated man who defended one of the most important pieces of Western literature that have or will ever be for the next maybe 50 years. Uh, but his children, Christopher Tolkien's children, would rather have a good BMW. You know what I mean? It didn't transfer. And part of the reason why we had the Rings of Power series was because, that's what they wanted. That's what they went for. The second they could. Um, it's it's hard to understand it, for people who don't see these things and don't get it. Uh, how do I want to put it? Like the culture that we have promotes um, the horrid, destructive line going up rather than anything else that could be. If the line doesn't go up, it's bad. Therefore, my line has to go up. Uh, and what it does is it sacrifices art. Um, as strange as it is to say that, not even the Normans, who were absolutely rapacious with their desire for land and wealth, they didn't just destroy. They spent money to rebuild the places they conquered. They didn't turn it into a third world despot where they wrung out every every penny they could while investing the bare minimum. Um, if you ever want to look at that stuff, CPG Gray has some great videos about that. like how how broken the system is for normal people, and it comes from that mindset. Um, Shiro says, I think. Sorry, Eldritch Fan says, this where it leads where you separate from the art from the artist. Shiro says, I think separate the art from the artist is an aesthetic move to enable interpretive freedom, whereas this forces an official interpretation on the work, which seems the opposite. Um, you can never separate the art from the artist. There's a stream with John C. Wright where essentially he goes, what does that mean? And if a genius is going, what? That's not real. You've got a problem with your philosophy. Joseph Conrad is often brought up. He is, even from for my sensibilities, he's fairly insensitive, we'll say. He has some interesting books with interesting titles that I cannot say. Um, uh, in and expect this stream to continue. There are a thousand little things that he's done that have been very interesting and make him an absolutely wonderful character to study. Obviously, not a nice man, but he was on our side, more or less, I'd say, if not a Christian. And they destroy him and they attack him because he spoke a lot of truth and he didn't back down from it. Um, MJ Marzo says, "Death of the author was one of the worst things to happen to college lit classes." Absolutely. Uh, and so through that, they often try to destroy and minimize his work. The problem is that he is one of the best authors of Western civilization. He's legitimately great. For the bones of every one great author we remember, there are hundreds of dead and buried authors we have forgotten. And honestly, most of them legitimately so. When they trample on the works of men like Joseph Conrad and Roald Dahl, whatever the character of the man, it pales in comparison to the blessing that the work that they did gave the world. Even though you might look at Roald Dahl and John C. Wright, there are a few. Honestly, they're all great. Um, Even if you look at Roald Dahl, if you look at other men, if you look at Joseph Conrad or Gobineau, or even modern men like Bronze Age Pervert, no one understands what they're saying unless you study them. Bronze Age Pervert is very confusing for a lot of Christians because he says anti-Christian things. He is not a Christian. He believes that cruelty to animals is basically a proof against God, and that Adam naming the animals is absolutely insulting. And he said other things in other streams beyond this one that makes me believe that this isn't just humor from him. He's not saying something like, "Well, Nietzsche worked out every day." You can't be a, if you're a nihilist, you can't be working out. Blah blah blah. Like he would say something ridiculous like that. He says stuff ridiculous like that. But when he says that, it's very understandable. He holds animals in an immensely high regard. He has said multiple times that, he views cruelty to animals as an unforgivable sin, and his voice cracks with emotion that where he says it. He drops the mask he's put on. So I believe him when he says he does not believe in Adam and Eve because Adam naming the animals is insulting. As weird as that sounds, you take that, you see that there are spiritual meanings in what he says, and then there are jokes, and then there are non-spiritual things he says that are practical, and you start to look through them, and you see that this guy switches between the spiritual, the physical, and a joke pretty much at will. You go through it, and then you see the quotes from other people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and the philosophers he reads, and you see that there is a strict philosophy underlying it. Now, I mention philosophy because it's easier to talk about these things with philosophy than it is for literature. With Roald Dahl, you see a man who bullied his wife into walking again. I'm being, whatever, but it's you see him bullying his wife, into walking again, and then you see him using bullying terms to describe women and men and other things like that, and it's clear that he would be a man who'd beat up on the weird sensitive kid who won't play sports and won't interact with people, like that. The boy who's probably a grooming target for a transgender community, that sort of thing. All right, and he tried to bully them to make them better to get them in line. Even though I don't think bullies quite think like that, but that's the end result in a healthy person. Um, you you take that you take that character trait that he is a bit of a bully, and then you see him using bullying terms for evil people, and that's probably a very clear connection in his life. It's probably something that happened to him on a daily basis, that he interacted with, that he thought about. It's it's like what I said with Bronze Age Pervert. You can look at the things and you can see his clear love of animals, and you can see why he has these attacks on Christianity. But you look at Roald Dahl and you see that the same rules apply. He has a bullying nature. He's successful in his bullying tactics, and it transfers into his art. The thought form is clear throughout it. This is a man who values the social order of things, who values people being healthy, even if he wouldn't say it like I'm saying it, and all these other things. Take that away, dull it, remove it, and you remove something that could affect somebody, in a way that they hadn't before. If the censorship continues, and by the way, this is not censorship of a pornographic work, it's not censorship of a work that is a thought virus that will spread like some of these things are. It removes an absolutely potent force for social good. If fat is evil and a mark of evil, then it should remain as such, rather than being, some sort of thing that has to be protected. One of the reasons why I support men like, Bronze Age Pervert and other non Christians, and even in a way like pre Christian Roosh, isn't because of some sort of desire to screw the women and, not that I'm any less lusty than the average man, or some sort of like attack on God or anything like that. It's because there are things in them that are absolutely necessary social goods that must be promulgated back into our society. Whether it's working out and exercising and having pride in your culture and looking at yourself truthfully, or how you interact with women, or how you treat, the people around you, or how you're supposed to think, it all flows in and out of each other. If if you read Roald Dahl's books and you see that all the evil characters are fat, that Miss Trunchbull is unkind, so she's not a woman, she's just, yeah, no. Wait, did she say? Excuse me, I got it backwards. That Mrs. Trunchbull is unkind, so she is merely a female, as if it is only an accident of birth, and so on and so forth. You see the negative patterns of society reflected in his work. Patterns that, quite frankly, for the stuff I've read, I've seen as, yeah, that's it. This is exactly right. Because I've met women like that. I've seen people, who are obsessed with their own fatness. Like I was flirting with some girls at my job, and where I at Mardi Gras, and this one girl's like, "Catch me, if you jump." No, you need to lose weight first, and I'd be happy to carry you up the stairs. And she's like, "Did you just tell me to diet?" Yes. And her friends tested me on it. They said, did you just call her fat? Yeah, she needs to lose weight, and I'd be happy to carry her up the stairs after. And so on and so forth. And they didn't cry or anything like that. But it's like, there's a time and place for this. And if I had been, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, you know, it would have caused an issue. But sticking to your guns and saying your fat friend is fat, and I'm not going to catch her if she falls down the stairs in a drunken stupor. Think about it. That's eh, I've kind of lost the point. But it's there for the taking for people who are willing to look at it. The problem of Roald Dahl being censored isn't that it's censorship. Quite frankly, I'm very pro censorship on a lot of things. I'm pro the destruction of art that is evil. But his work isn't evil. And in fact, what they're attacking is not, certain Christian behaviors or anything like that. It's basic social decency. I can deal with attacks on Christianity all day. But this, there's more gravy than the grave to this one, or there's more grave than the gravy to this one to use it properly. And going through things, I think we're going to see a lot more of this as they desperately try to keep society in their corner and their ideals. And it's going to be pushed further and further and further. They've already done it to Lord of the Rings with Rings of Power. They will do it with the Chronicles of Narnia. They will do it with whatever beloved children's book you have. They tried to do it with Redwall, but it was in and out. The author was still living at that time. And more and more and more and more and more. Eventually, uh, there will be nothing left, and people will not handle being given real good things. They will not be able to handle reading John C. Wright or Anthony's works or my works or Bradford or Brian Niemeyer and others for the simple reason that they won't be able to take it. And if they can't take us, they can't take men like Joseph Conrad. They'll barely be able to handle C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And eventually, as these cycles go, because it is a cycle, they'll just kind of be unable to do it until the next generation that can handle it will rise up. And I think that they're beginning to be born now. I think some of the Zoomers and certainly Generation Alpha are starting to really go for it, which is why there's so much destruction of children tier literature and culture and so on. Which makes our duty to preserve as much as we can all the more important. Well,
Yep.
we went longer than I expected. Anthony, do you have anything else you'd like to talk about?
I said everything that I want to say.
Excellent. Uh, and I have said everything that I wish to say as well, at least for the moment. Uh, as these things go on, we will document it, whether or not there is a market for it, because the line, maybe the line doesn't go up forever. Uh, Mostly because if they think they can get away with it, they're going to do it more. I'll talk to you guys next week where we will do something. I don't know what though. Uh, have a good night, guys.